At 2:07 a.m., a Harvard professor turned on the lecture hall lights and caught the janitor finishing an equation his graduate students had failed for weeks.
Which means the
But what
variable
froze him in
cancels
place
out,
was not the
stabilizing
solution.
equation.
It was the calm of a man who had nothing left to prove and
theory?
everything left to lose. Ethan Cole entered Harvard the way most people were trained not to see, through a service door that closed with a soft hiss, as if the building itself agreed to keep him unnamed. The corridor behind Jefferson Hall breathed cold air and old wax. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. His keycard blinked green. The clock near the loading bay read 1:42 a.m. And for a moment, Ethan felt the familiar weight of time, how it could be counted down to the minute when you lived on paychecks and inhalers and the thin mercy of a quiet night. He pushed his cart forward. The wheels creaked and he hated that sound, not because anyone was listening, but because it proved he existed. Ethan had learned to live where existence invited questions. Mop, bucket, cleaner, trash liners, things meant to remove traces. His hands were raw from chemicals. The skin along his knuckles had cracks that never fully healed, as if the world kept asking him to open and close his fists. On his right hand sat a plain metal ring, dull with wear. Inside it were two words, small, almost private. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. Lily's breathing at night was enough to remind him what mattered. Jefferson Hall slept in layers, the marble that held footsteps for centuries, the lecture rooms that held chalk dust and ambition, the offices that held quiet wars of reputation. Ethan moved through it with practiced care, emptying bins, wiping podiums, aligning chairs as if order could be a kind of prayer. Lecture Room B was open wider than usual. A strip of light from the hallway fell across the front wall, catching the edge of a blackboard crowded with symbols. Someone had left a battle unfinished. Ethan stopped at the threshold. The board wasn't just messy, it was strained. Lines of equations pressed against one another, non-linear terms refusing to be tamed, constraints set like fences that didn't actually hold. A question had been asked here with confidence, and the room had answered with silence. He told himself to move on. He had floors to finish, a bus to catch, a daughter to wake up for school with a smile that didn't betray how little sleep he got. And yet, there was something in that half-erased system that reached into him, the way a familiar melody can pull tears from someone who swears they are fine. Not because it was beautiful, because it was unfinished. Ethan rolled the cart inside and let the door ease shut behind him. He did it without drama, without a decision that could be named. His body simply moved the way it always did when something true stood in front of him. The chalk rested on the tray, snapped in two. He picked up the longer piece. It left a white ghost on his fingertips. He read the board slowly, not as an intruder, but as someone listening. A common approach had been attempted. Iteration, substitution, forcing convergence. The math resisted because the framing was wrong. They were trying to wrestle an animal that needed to be led. Ethan erased a single line, then another, only enough to create a clean breath of space. He didn't wipe away the whole effort. That would have been disrespectful. He knew what effort cost. In the quiet, an idea rose, not loud, not triumphant, just steady. What if the constraint was not a boundary, but a symmetry? He tested it in his head first, letting the terms slide into place. The structure softened. The system began to look less like a wall and more like a door with a hidden hinge. He wrote, a reformulation, a shift of variables, a small factor pulled out where it had been choking everything else. His chalk moved with restraint. No flourish, no performance. Only the clean economy of someone who had once done this because he loved it, and had stopped because love does not buy medicine. Minutes slipped away. Or maybe the room simply forgot how to count. Ethan stepped back. The problem was not fully solved, but it was turning. A keystone had been placed where weight had been crushing the structure. The board now held a direction that could breathe. He set the chalk down gently. And then instinct returned. Rule. Habit. The quiet life of a man who cleaned other people's outcomes. He reached for the eraser. The lights snapped on. Harsh white brightness flooded the hall, flattening shadows, erasing the comfort of dimness. Ethan froze with the eraser in his hand, caught in the simple crime of thinking out loud on someone else's board. At the back of the room stood Professor Whitmore. He was not tall in a dramatic way, but his presence carried the weight of rooms that rearranged themselves around him. His face was composed, sharp eyes, restrained mouth, the kind of discipline that didn't need to raise its voice. He said nothing at first. His gaze moved from the board to Ethan, from Ethan to the cart, from the cart back to the board. It was the look of a man trained to distrust coincidence. Whitmore walked down the aisle with measured steps. The sound of his shoes on the floor made the room feel suddenly official, as if the air had been called to order. He stopped near the front and stared at the new lines Ethan had written. He leaned in slightly. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in concentration, the narrowing of a mind that recognizes something it didn't expect to find. Ethan lowered the eraser. "I can," he began, and then swallowed the rest. Explaining felt like begging, and he had promised himself long ago he would not beg in places built to make men like him feel small. Whitmore's voice cut cleanly through the silence. "Do not erase the board." The words were cold, but not cruel. A command without ornament. Ethan set the eraser down, careful as if he were placing something fragile. He stood with his hands at his sides, waiting for what came next. Whitmore traced one part of the work with a finger, stopping at the shift where everything changed. He breathed out once, a controlled exhale that might have been surprise if he allowed himself that weakness. "Who wrote this?" he asked. Ethan didn't look away. "I did, sir." Whitmore turned his head slightly, studying him now as a person rather than a problem. Ethan felt, for one brief moment, the danger of being seen. "You're—" Whitmore glanced at the cart. "Night staff." "Yes." Whitmore's eyes dropped to the side pocket of the cart, where a worn spiral notebook peeked out, old, creased, held together by a tired elastic band. It did not belong to the university. It belonged to a life that had been patched and repatched. Whitmore reached into his jacket and took out a folded sheet of paper. He walked to the lectern and placed it on the desk. To keep it from curling, he weighted it with a piece of chalk. "For tomorrow," he said, as if tomorrow were a given and not a thing that had to be survived hour by hour. Ethan stared at the paper. A question, neatly typed. No name, no signature, only the quiet shape of a challenge. Whitmore turned toward the door. Ethan's voice came out before he could stop it. "Professor, I shouldn't have touched the board." Whitmore paused without turning fully. "You shouldn't erase it," he corrected, and then added, almost as if the words were a duty he disliked, "not when it's finally saying something true." Then he walked out, leaving the lecture hall bright behind him. Ethan remained at the front, the board alive with white lines, the paper waiting on the desk like a small, dangerous promise. He did not pick it up yet. He simply stood there and listened to the quiet, because the quiet was where his life had always made its decisions. Outside Jefferson Hall, the clock moved toward 2:07 a.m. And on the desk, something had been left behind. Tomorrow. Ethan waited until the fluorescent hum settled back into silence before he touched anything. The lecture hall still held the warmth of Professor Whitmore's presence like an afterimage, an imprint not of kindness but of authority. In that bright room, under those lights, Ethan had felt the old, dangerous sensation of being measured, not by his uniform, not by his cart, by his mind. He walked to the desk and picked up the paper. It was a single page, neatly typed, no letterhead, no name. At the top was a line so simple it looked almost innocent. Beneath it, the problem opened like a trap. Clean statements, tight assumptions, a conclusion that could only be reached if you saw the hidden hinge. Ethan's throat tightened. This wasn't an assignment. It was a door. He folded the sheet carefully and slipped it into the side pocket of his cart, beside the worn spiral notebook that always traveled with him. The notebook's cover was soft with years, the coil slightly bent, pages inside crowded with sketches of arguments, fragments of proofs, lists of grocery prices, and on some days, little stars Lily drew when she sat beside him at the kitchen table. When he finished his shift, the sky outside was still dark. Cambridge was quiet, holding its breath before morning traffic began its long crawl. Ethan caught the first bus home, shoulders heavy with fatigue he couldn't afford to feel. At their apartment, the heat rattled unevenly. The living room smelled faintly of detergent and the peppermint ointment he rubbed on Lily's chest on cold nights. He washed his hands at the sink, watching gray water spiral down the drain, and then stood in the doorway of Lily's room. She slept with one arm thrown above her head, hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Her inhaler sat on the nightstand, where Ethan always placed it. In the dim light, her face looked younger than 7, softer, as if the day hadn't taught her yet how to carry herself. Ethan leaned in and listened for her breath. Steady, quiet. Only then did his chest loosen. He stepped back without waking her. He did not allow himself the luxury of relief. Relief was something life punished with sudden alarms. In the kitchen, he set the spiral notebook on the table and unfolded Whitmore's paper. The problem stared back at him, calm and merciless. A small part of him, the part that had once belonged in classrooms, felt the familiar ignition. Another part, the larger part, did the math of survival. If he stayed up, he'd be slower tomorrow. If he was slower, he might miss a shift. If he missed a shift, he'd lose hours. If he lost hours, the inhaler refill would become a choice between breathing and rent. He stared at the paper until the lines blurred. Then he picked up a pen anyway. He didn't reach for textbooks. He didn't open a laptop. He didn't search for methods that belonged to people who had time. He listened. He wrote the statement in his own words, as if translating it into a language his life could understand. He drew a small diagram in the margin, not to decorate, but to see. He marked a term that looked too symmetrical to be accidental. He circled an assumption that most people would accept without questioning. Ethan didn't solve with spectacle, he solved with restraint. He worked like someone repairing an engine with only the tools in his pocket. Hours thinned. The apartment stayed silent except for the faint tick of the radiator and the occasional whisper of Lily's breathing through the wall. Ethan paused once to drink water, then returned to the page. At some point, the solution didn't arrive like a victory. It arrived like a truth that had been waiting for him to stop forcing it. He found the pivot, an invariant hiding inside the structure, a property that stayed unchanged no matter how the rest of the expression shifted. The moment he saw it, the rest unfolded with quiet inevitability. Not easy, not pretty, but clean. He wrote the final line, then sat still. His eyes burned. His body felt hollow with exhaustion. But inside that hollow, something held. Not pride, permission. He tore out the page and slid it into the notebook, tucked beneath Lily's drawings of stars. Then he closed the cover and pressed his palm flat against it, as if the cheap cardboard could keep his life from coming apart. When the alarm rang at 6:10 a.m., Ethan stood up as if he had never sat. He woke Lily gently, helped her into her sweater, packed her backpack with her lunch and her inhaler. She yawned and blinked at him, then smiled with a kind of trust that always made his throat ache. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "A little," Ethan lied. Lily didn't argue. She had learned in her 7 years that adults had secrets made of fatigue. At the bus stop, the wind cut through Ethan's jacket. He kept one hand in his pocket, fingers touching the spiral notebook like a talisman. Lily leaned against his side, drawing invisible shapes on his sleeve. "Daddy," she said softly, "I had a dream." "What kind?" She pointed up at the pale morning sky. There were stars, but it was daytime, and people could still see them. Ethan looked where she pointed, and felt something inside him shift, almost painfully. "That's a good dream," he said. He dropped her off at school with a kiss to her forehead that lingered one heartbeat too long. Then he went back to work, different work, day work, moving boxes for a campus vendor, hands raw, back aching, mind still quietly turning around the problem he had solved in the night. By late afternoon, his eyes were heavy. By evening, his legs trembled. But at 11:30 p.m., he returned to Harvard for his night shift because life did not care what his mind could do. Jefferson Hall greeted him with the same cold breath, the same hum, the same indifference. Ethan pushed his cart toward Lecture Room B. The door was closed this time. He hesitated, then knocked lightly, as if he had any right to announce himself. A moment later, the door opened. Professor Whitmore stood there as composed as the night before. He didn't look surprised to see Ethan, as if he had been expecting him the way one expects gravity. "Come in," Whitmore said. Ethan entered, cart left outside, hands suddenly too aware of their roughness, the chemical stains that would not wash away. Whitmore nodded toward the front desk. "The paper." Ethan reached into his pocket, pulled out the spiral notebook, and from inside it, the page he had written. He laid it on the desk without explaining. Whitmore picked it up and read. He read slowly. Not because he struggled, because he respected precision. Minutes passed. Whitmore's face did not change, but his eyes sharpened, the way a blade does when it remembers it was made to cut. Finally, Whitmore set the page down. "You didn't use the standard approach," he said. "No," Ethan replied. "Why?" Ethan's mouth went dry. He could have said the truth, that standard approaches assumed you had time to fail first, that his life did not allow failure as a rehearsal. Instead, he said, "Because it didn't fit." Whitmore looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that stripped away excuses and left only a person. Then he nodded once. "Come back tomorrow," he said again, the same words as before, but this time they landed heavier, less like permission, more like a decision. Ethan held his breath. Whitmore added, almost clinically, "Same time." Ethan swallowed. "Professor, I work. I have a child." Whitmore's gaze flickered, not to sympathy but to recognition of weight. "Then you know what discipline is," he said. "Not theory. Practice." Ethan nodded, because that was the only safe response. He turned to leave, and as he did, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from the after-school program. Lily had needed her inhaler twice today. Ethan's vision narrowed. The lecture hall, the chalk, the paper. All of it suddenly felt far away, like a dream that didn't belong to him. He looked back at Whitmore, but the professor was already facing the board, writing a new line of symbols as if the world outside the room didn't exist. Ethan stepped into the corridor, the cold air striking his face. Tomorrow. A word that sounded simple until life asked what it would cost, and in the silence between his footsteps, Ethan understood something with a clarity that hurt. To make tomorrow real, he would have to pay for it. At home. Ethan did not tell Lily about the paper. Some things, he had learned, grew best in silence. Morning arrived without ceremony. The alarm rang, the kettle hissed, the radiator knocked like a stubborn knuckle against metal. Ethan moved through the apartment with the efficiency of someone who had learned to do many things without thinking about them. Thinking cost energy. Energy was rationed. Lily sat at the small kitchen table, legs swinging, a crayon clutched in her hand. She was drawing stars again, five-pointed, uneven, scattered across the page like they had escaped some larger order. "Why do you always draw them?" Ethan asked, pouring oatmeal into a bowl. She shrugged. "Because they're there even when you can't see them." He smiled at that, the kind of smile that stayed mostly inside. Lily had a way of saying things that felt older than 7. Or maybe she just said them before the world taught her to stop. He helped her with her inhaler, watched until her breathing settled, then zipped her jacket and walked her to school. At the door, she hugged him tightly, her arms small but certain. "Don't forget," she said, pointing at the sky. "Daytime stars." "I won't," Ethan replied, though he wasn't sure what forgetting would even look like. After he left her, Ethan went to work, day work this time, lifting, sorting, moving boxes that belonged to people who would never know his name. His back ached by noon. His hands burned, but his mind kept drifting, not to equations exactly, but to the feeling of alignment he had known the night before. The sense that something inside him still worked the way it used to. That feeling frightened him more than exhaustion ever had. Because wanting was dangerous. He remembered a different time when wanting had seemed reasonable. Years ago, before Lily's room, before inhalers and night shifts, Ethan had sat in a lecture hall not unlike Jefferson's, notebook open, chalk dust floating through a beam of afternoon light. A professor had stood at the board, impatient with sloppy thinking, ruthless with imprecision. "You don't solve mathematics by force," the professor had said. "You solve it by listening." Ethan had listened. He had listened well enough that people noticed, well enough that encouragement followed him like a quiet tide. Scholarships discussed. Recommendations offered. A future that assumed continuity. And then continuity broke. The phone call. The hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and apology. The moment he realized that loving someone did not protect them from disappearing. After that, there had been Lily. Small, fragile, breathing like a question that had to be answered again and again. Ethan had withdrawn from school without drama. No speeches, no bitterness. Just a signature at the bottom of a form, and a life that bent itself around survival. Math became something he did at night, in margins, on scraps of paper he never intended to show anyone. The spiral notebook began then. At first it was practical, calculations, budgets, lists. Then, slowly, proofs crept back in. Ideas that needed somewhere to rest. He never finished them properly. He never had time. But the act of writing kept something alive that would have otherwise gone quiet. That notebook was the only place where he still belonged to himself. That evening, after Lily was asleep and the apartment had settled into its thin quiet, Ethan took the notebook out again. He did not open Whitmore's problem. He turned instead to an older page, half a proof he had abandoned years ago, interrupted mid-sentence by a grocery list written sideways along the margin. He traced the lines with his finger. There was comfort in incompleteness. In knowing that something unfinished did not accuse you of failure, it simply waited. At 10:45 p.m., Ethan left for work. The bus ride back to Harvard was slower than usual. He watched the city slide past the window, lights blinking in patterns he had learned to read. Restaurants closing. Offices dark. Buildings shedding their importance one floor at a time. Jefferson Hall greeted him as it always did, indifferent and immense. He pushed his cart down the service corridor, the wheels softer now, as if even the sound had learned restraint. His tasks were the same: clean, wipe, straighten, erase. He performed them carefully, as though precision might spill from one act into another. When he reached Lecture Room B, the door was closed again. He did not knock this time. Inside, Professor Whitmore stood at the board, writing. The room smelled of chalk and concentration. A stack of papers lay on the desk, aligned perfectly, corners squared. Whitmore did not turn immediately. "You're early," he said. Ethan checked the time. "I had a lighter route." Whitmore nodded once, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. He stepped aside from the board and gestured toward the chalk. "Explain your thinking," he said, "from the beginning." Ethan hesitated. Explanation was harder than solving. Solutions could hide behind symbols. Thinking required exposure. He took the chalk anyway. He did not begin with formulas. He began with structure, with why certain approaches failed, and where intuition could be trusted if it was disciplined enough. He spoke quietly, stopping when he reached the place where certainty ended. "I don't know if it closes fully," he said, honest to the point of discomfort. "But this is where it stops being noise." Whitmore listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the board was not beautiful. It was sparse, incomplete. But it was true. For the first time, Whitmore did not respond immediately. He studied the board, then Ethan, then the notebook peeking from the cart by the door. "You stopped," Whitmore said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because forcing it would be dishonest." Something shifted in Whitmore's expression, not approval, not warmth, but recognition, as if he had been waiting a long time to hear that answer from someone who understood its cost. "You understand," Whitmore said slowly, "that this is not how we normally evaluate." Ethan nodded. "I'm not normal here." Whitmore almost smiled. "Next time," he said, erasing a small section of the board, "we'll test that." Ethan felt the word test settle into him, not as threat, but as weight. When he left the room, his phone buzzed again. Another message, another reminder that Lily's world did not pause for intellectual possibility. Ethan leaned briefly against the cold stone wall of the corridor, eyes closed, breathing through the familiar pressure in his chest. 2 lives. 1 body. 1 set of hours that refused to stretch. And somewhere between the service corridor and the lecture hall, a line was being drawn. Quietly, deliberately. Toward midnight. The message arrived without ceremony. No subject line, no greeting. Just a time and a place. 12:30 a.m. Lecture Room B. Ethan read it twice before he understood what it meant. Midnight was when he worked. Midnight was when his body knew how to function without asking questions. Midnight was not when people were tested. He tucked the phone back into his pocket and finished tying Lily's shoes. She sat on the edge of the couch, swinging her legs. Watching him with the serious attention she reserved for moments she sensed mattered. "You look tired," she said. "I always look tired," Ethan replied, smiling. She considered that. "Then you look the same." That, too, was a kind of mercy. He walked her to school, waited until she disappeared into the building, then stood for a moment longer than necessary on the sidewalk. The air was sharp with early winter. Somewhere above the low gray clouds, stars were doing what they always did, whether anyone noticed or not. At his day job, Ethan moved through the hours carefully. He drank water when he remembered. He lifted with his legs. He kept his hands steady. Tonight would demand attention, and attention was a resource he guarded. By evening, fatigue settled into his bones like sediment. He cooked dinner, helped Lily with her homework, listened to her explain a drawing where the stars were arranged in a spiral instead of scattered. "They're moving," she said, "just slowly." He kissed her forehead before she went to bed and stayed until her breathing evened out. When he finally stood, his legs trembled, not from weakness, but from restraint. At 11:50 p.m., Ethan caught the bus back to Harvard. Jefferson Hall was awake in a different way tonight. Lights burned in places that were usually dark. The building did not hum. It listened. Lecture Room B stood open. Inside, Professor Whitmore waited. The board was clean. The desk held a single folder. No chalk lay on the tray. No paper waited like an invitation. The room had been stripped of comfort. "This is not an exam," Whitmore said, as Ethan entered, "and it is not a favor." Ethan nodded. He stood where Whitmore indicated, hands loose at his sides. "I want to see how you think," Whitmore continued. "Not what you know, not what you remember. How you decide when to stop." Whitmore opened the folder and removed 3 pages. He placed them face down on the desk, then slid one toward Ethan. "Begin." The problem was unlike the others. No neat framing, no clear endpoint, a structure that could be approached from several directions, each with its own traps. It was the kind of question that rewarded speed and punished care, or the other way around, depending on who you were. Ethan read slowly. He did not reach for the chalk. Instead, he spoke. He described the space the problem lived in, the constraints that mattered and the ones that only pretended to. He outlined 2 approaches and discarded both, explaining why they failed before they failed. He paused, considering a third. Whitmore said nothing. Minutes passed. The clock at the back of the room ticked loudly enough to feel personal. Ethan stepped to the board and wrote a single line. Then another. He stopped before the temptation to decorate arrived. He erased 1 mark and left the rest standing. "I can take it further," he said quietly. "But it won't be honest." Whitmore folded his arms. "Explain." Ethan turned. His eyes were clear, though his face carried the strain of a man balancing too many nights. "The structure suggests a closure that depends on regularity we don't actually have. If I push it, I'll get an answer. It will look right. It will be wrong." Whitmore studied him for a long moment. "Most people would finish." "I know. Why don't you?" Ethan hesitated. Not because he lacked an answer, but because the answer was not academic. "Because my life doesn't let me practice being wrong in public." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. Whitmore nodded once. "Stop there," he said. Ethan stepped back. His hands were damp, his shoulders ached. He had not realized how much he had been holding until he let go. Whitmore closed the folder and placed it back on the desk. "This," he said, "is a midnight test. We don't record it. We don't grade it. We don't discuss it." "Then what is it for?" Ethan asked. Whitmore's gaze softened by a fraction. "For me." He turned to the board, erased everything Ethan had written, and left a single symbol behind. Small, precise, intentional. "Tomorrow," Whitmore said, "we do this again." Ethan's phone vibrated in his pocket before he could respond. A message from Lily's school nurse. "Mild episode. Resolved. Just informing you." Ethan closed his eyes. The relief came sharp and fast, followed immediately by the familiar guilt of having been elsewhere when it happened. Whitmore noticed the movement. "Go," he said, already turning away. Daylight next time. Ethan nodded, throat tight. He left the room without looking back, the echo of the test still ringing in his ears. In the corridor, the air felt colder than before. The service lights cast long shadows that stretched and narrowed with his steps. He leaned against the wall for a moment, breathing through the pressure, reminding himself of what was real. Lily. Work. Time. And now something else, unnamed, uncounted, had entered the ledger. When he straightened and continued down the corridor, the clock ticked past 1, and ahead of him, waiting without mercy or apology, was daylight. Daylight changed everything. Ethan felt it the moment he stepped out of the subway station. The campus looked different in the morning, open, confident, unashamed of itself. Buildings that felt indifferent at night now stood like declarations. Students moved in clusters, laughing, arguing, already convinced they belonged. He adjusted the strap of his worn backpack and checked the time. 9:10 a.m. He had slept less than 3 hours. The seminar room was on the 3rd floor of Jefferson Hall, the same building, a different world. When Ethan entered, the conversation dipped. Not enough to be rude, just enough to register his presence as unexpected. Heads turned, eyes assessed. Then the room resumed itself, rearranging into a shape that did not include him. He chose a seat near the back. The tables were arranged in a loose square. Laptops glowed. Notebooks lay open, clean and confident. The air buzzed with familiarity, the easy shorthand of people who had shared years of the same language, the same assumptions. Ethan rested his hands on the table and waited. Jason Miller sat across from him. Jason looked exactly like the room expected him to look. Tailored jacket, expensive watch worn casually, posture relaxed in the way that came from never having to explain yourself. He leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting on his knee, eyes drifting briefly to Ethan before sliding away again. A smile touched his mouth. Not unkind, not friendly, certain. Professor Whitmore entered without announcement. The room stilled immediately. Today, Whitmore said, placing his notes on the table, we're discussing Fourier representations in constrained systems. Ethan's spine straightened. The problem appeared on the screen, dense, elegant, unforgiving. A function decomposed under conditions that resisted neat closure, the kind of problem that invited confident errors. Whitmore gestured. Thoughts? Hands went up. Students spoke fluently about orthogonality, boundary behavior, known expansions. Each contribution was polished, correct in isolation, incomplete in totality. Ethan listened. He could feel the familiar pressure building, not urgency, but misalignment. Something was being missed. Not a mistake, an assumption. Jason raised his hand last. This reduces cleanly, he said, standing slightly as he spoke. If you assume smooth convergence at the boundary, the rest follows standard decomposition. Several heads nodded. It sounded right. It was almost right. Whitmore did not respond immediately. His eyes scanned the room. Then, unexpectedly, they settled on Ethan. You, Whitmore said. What do you see? The room went very still. Ethan felt heat rise in his face. Not shame, but exposure. He had not planned to speak. Daylight was dangerous. Daylight invited comparison. I see a problem with that assumption, he said carefully. Jason turned, eyebrow lifting. Go on, Whitmore said. Ethan stood. His legs felt heavy, but his voice held. If you assume smooth convergence, you erase the behavior at the constraint. The boundary isn't passive. It feeds back. A murmur rippled through the room. Jason smiled again, thinner this time. "With respect," he said, "that's not how Fourier theory works in practice." Ethan met his gaze. "It is when the system isn't ideal." Whitmore said nothing. Ethan walked to the board. He picked up the chalk, not with confidence, but with acceptance. He wrote a single line, then paused. "This term," he said, pointing, "is treated as negligible. It isn't. It accumulates." He reworked the expansion, not fully, just enough to show the fracture. A correction term emerged, small but decisive. The solution shifted. Silence followed. Jason leaned forward now, interest sharpened into something else. "That correction collapses under normalization," he said quickly. "It doesn't," Ethan replied. "Not if you respect the domain." He stopped there. He did not decorate the board. He did not finish the derivation. He had learned when stopping preserved truth. Whitmore stepped forward. He studied the board, then looked at Ethan. "This is correct," he said. The words landed cleanly. No emphasis, no apology. Jason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Whitmore continued. "The assumption fails under constraint. Mr. Cole's approach is more accurate." Mr. Cole. Ethan felt the name settle on him like a weight and a gift at the same time. Whitmore turned back to the room. "Daylight does not make a method right," he said. "Consensus does not replace rigor." The seminar resumed, but something had shifted. The air was sharper now. Eyes lingered longer. Whispers followed Ethan when he returned to his seat. Jason did not speak again. When the session ended, students gathered their things in a flurry of motion. Some glanced at Ethan with curiosity, others avoided him entirely. Jason stopped beside Ethan's table. "Interesting work," he said lightly. "Where did you study?" Ethan closed his notebook. "Here, a long time ago." Jason's smile faded just enough to reveal calculation. "Harvard doesn't usually forget people like that." "Sometimes it does," Ethan said. Jason nodded once and walked away. Ethan remained seated for a moment after the room emptied. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the delayed cost of effort. He thought of Lily, of the inhaler in her backpack, of the bus schedule taped to the fridge. Daylight had seen him, and Daylight, he knew, never looked away. As he stood and headed for the door, he felt the weight of eyes on his back, not hostile, not welcoming, simply aware. The corridor outside was bright, busy, loud. Ethan moved through it carefully, as if the light itself could bruise. Behind him, something invisible had begun to take shape. Ahead of him, waiting without warmth, was scrutiny. The summons came on paper, not an email, not a message sent carelessly between meetings. A printed notice slid into Ethan's locker at the end of his shift, folded once, his name typed cleanly at the top. Request for clarification. Informal review. The language was precise enough to sound harmless. Ethan knew better. Precision was how institutions protected themselves while pretending to ask questions. He read it twice, then folded it back along the same crease. The cart beside him waited, patient and mute. Around him, the service corridor went on with its quiet routines, keys jangling, doors opening and closing, the low music of maintenance work that never made it into official records. At home, Lily was at the kitchen table with her crayons spread like a small constellation. She looked up when he entered, eyes bright. "I made you one," she said, holding up a drawing. A star, larger than the rest, outlined carefully, almost shyly. "For what?" Ethan asked. "For later," she said. "In case it gets dark." He taped it to the fridge next to the bus schedule and the pharmacy number. Then he sat with her while she ate, listening to her talk about school, about a boy who ran too fast, about how breathing felt heavy during recess but lighter afterward. That night, when Lily slept, Ethan opened the spiral notebook and slid out the notice. He placed it between pages filled with half-proofs and grocery totals, as if the paper needed to be reminded what kind of life it was entering. The meeting was set for the following afternoon. He arrived early. The room was small and undecorated, chosen not for comfort but for neutrality. A table, 3 chairs, a window that looked out on nothing in particular. 2 administrators sat together, hands folded, expressions tuned to professional concern. Jason Miller sat opposite them, relaxed, composed, already at ease. Professor Whitmore arrived last. He did not greet anyone. He took his seat and placed a thin folder on the table. "We'll keep this brief," one of the administrators said. "There's been an informal complaint." Jason leaned forward slightly. "No accusation," he said smoothly. "Just a question of process." Ethan listened without interrupting. He had learned that interruptions were interpreted as guilt. "The concern," the administrator continued, "is that Mr. Cole has had access to materials outside formal enrollment." "Access is not instruction," Whitmore said flatly. Jason smiled. "But influence matters. Standards matter." Whitmore opened the folder. Inside were copies, old transcripts, recommendation letters, notes written in careful handwriting from years ago. Evidence that Ethan had once belonged to this world in a way paperwork remembered even when people didn't. "These were never submitted," the administrator said. "They were," Whitmore replied. "They were never read." Silence settled over the table. Whitmore slid forward another document. Library logs, time-stamped entries showing Ethan's presence in public spaces, late at night, alone. Notes on the margin tracked progress, not sudden leaps but steady accumulation. "No unauthorized access," Whitmore said. "No breach. No misconduct." Jason's expression tightened. "This still creates an appearance problem." "Truth is not obligated to manage appearances," Whitmore replied. Ethan felt something unfamiliar then. Not triumph, not relief, but a strange gratitude for accuracy. For facts that did not embellish him, only placed him where he had always been. The administrator cleared her throat. "The review finds no violation." Jason leaned back, disappointment flickering quickly into calculation. Whitmore closed the folder. "Then we're done." Outside, the hallway felt louder than it should have. Ethan walked slowly, the weight in his chest shifting but not lifting. He did not mistake survival for safety. Whitmore stopped beside him near the stairwell. "You understand," he said. "This will not end interest." Ethan nodded. "I didn't expect it to." Whitmore studied him for a moment, then added, "You should prepare." "For what?" "For choice." At home that evening, Ethan told Lily he might be late again. She nodded, serious, and pressed the star drawing into his hand. "So you don't forget," she said. He slipped it into the spiral notebook. The file was closed, but somewhere beyond paper and policy, something else had begun to open. A door. The examination began at 7:00 a.m. Precisely. Ethan arrived 15 minutes early, not out of confidence, but habit. Early was safer. Early allowed mistakes to stay small. The room was larger than he expected, sunlit, orderly, designed for performance. Rows of desks faced forward. Windows framed a pale Cambridge morning, the kind that looked generous even when it wasn't. A proctor checked names with clipped efficiency. No one spoke above a whisper. Ethan took his seat near the aisle. Around him sat students who had slept, who had prepared in the ways institutions recognized. Their pens were aligned, their water bottles full. Some stretched their fingers, some closed their eyes, rehearsing formulas like prayers. Jason Miller sat 2 rows ahead. He turned once, briefly, as if to confirm Ethan's presence. Their eyes met. Jason's expression was unreadable, neither hostile nor friendly, simply alert. The papers were handed out face down. "Begin," the proctor said. Ethan turned the page. The first questions were technical, dense, but fair. He worked through them carefully, not fast, not slow. He wrote only what needed to be written. No flourishes, no proof for the sake of proof. His hand ached early, the old cracks in his knuckles protesting, but he ignored them. Halfway through, the room settled into the rhythm of concentrated effort, the quiet scratch of pens, the occasional cough, the low hum of ventilation. Then Ethan reached the final problem. It was not long. That was the first warning. The statement was clean, almost polite, but the structure beneath it twisted in ways that resisted closure. A system defined just precisely enough to tempt a complete solution, just loosely enough to make that solution dishonest. Ethan felt his breath slow. This was not a trick. It was a test of restraint. He read the question again, then once more, as if the words might change their mind. They didn't. The problem asked for more than could be responsibly given. Across the room, Jason was already writing. Ethan did not rush to compete. He took a moment, one he could not afford, but took anyway, and let the system sit in his mind the way it wanted to. He traced its limits. He identified the places where certainty broke down. He could force it. He knew how, but he also knew what forcing cost. Ethan began to write. He stated the assumptions clearly. He derived what could be derived without lying. Where the argument reached its edge, he stopped. He wrote a final paragraph, not an answer, but an explanation. Under these conditions, a full solution cannot be claimed without additional structure. However, the behavior may be bounded as follows. He set his pen down. The room felt suddenly too bright. When time was called, chairs scraped back, tension releasing itself in uneven waves. Students gathered their things, voices low, but energized. Jason stood immediately, papers stacked neatly, expression satisfied. Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, hands flat on the desk. His heart beat steadily, not with fear but with the quiet knowledge that he had told the truth. Outside the room, the hallway filled with conversation. "Did you get the last one?" "I think so. It simplifies if you—" Jason passed Ethan near the stairwell. "Bold choice," he said, nodding toward the exam booklet. "Leaving it open." Ethan met his gaze. It was open. Jason smiled thinly. "Exams usually reward closure." "Life doesn't," Ethan replied. Jason's smile faded, replaced by something sharper. He turned and walked away. The results came faster than Ethan expected. 2 days later, Professor Whitmore stopped him in the corridor between shifts. He did not soften his voice. He did not lower it either. "You placed first," he said. Ethan blinked. "There must be a mistake." "There isn't." Whitmore held out a sheet, scores listed without names, but the top mark unmistakable. The margin beside it was filled with Whitmore's handwriting, notes dense and precise. "You were the only one who didn't pretend certainty," Whitmore said. "That matters." Ethan felt the weight of the words settle in his chest, heavy and fragile at once. "What happens now?" Whitmore studied him. "Now," he said, "people will talk." They did. Whispers moved faster than facts. Some were curious, some impressed, others suspicious. How had a night janitor outperformed funded researchers? What access had he been given? Who was protecting him? Jason did not speak publicly. He didn't need to. By the end of the week, Ethan noticed the change. Conversations paused when he entered a room. Emails stopped including him by accident. Doors closed more quietly. At home, Lily sensed it before Ethan said anything. "You're quieter," she said, watching him stir a pot that didn't need stirring. "I'm thinking," Ethan replied. "About what?" He considered lying. He didn't. "About how doing well doesn't always make things easier." She nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "Stars don't either," she said. "They just get noticed." That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table and opened the spiral notebook. He tucked the exam notice inside, beside Lily's drawing. 2 kinds of evidence, 2 kinds of truth. He closed the notebook and rested his hand on it, feeling the familiar bend of the coil, the softness of the cover worn by years of being carried quietly. He had passed the examination, but passing, he was beginning to understand, did not bring silence. It brought attention, and attention, once earned, never arrived alone. It brought consequence. The rumor did not announce itself. It arrived sideways, unfinished sentences, lowered voices, an email that never quite named what it suggested. Ethan felt it first as a change in temperature. The rooms he entered grew cautious. The air tightened. By the time the word cheating appeared, no one needed to say it out loud. It surfaced in the language institutions used when they wanted distance without responsibility. Irregularities, procedural concerns, questions regarding access. The phrases traveled quickly because they sounded reasonable and asked nothing of the people who repeated them. Ethan learned about the investigation from a notice pinned to the board near the service entrance. No name, no explanation, just a line about a temporary review and a reminder to cooperate fully. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the paper fluttering slightly in the draft. He had known this would come. Success, he had learned, was a spotlight that made shadows look intentional. At home, Lily was building a careful tower of blocks on the living room floor. She glanced up when he entered. "You're late," she said, not accusing, just noticing. "I had to read something," Ethan replied. She returned to her tower. "Does reading make you sad?" "Sometimes," he said. She nodded, accepting this as a feature of the world. The next afternoon, Ethan sat before the academic committee. The room was wider than the one used for informal reviews, its table polished to a dull reflection. 5 members sat evenly spaced, faces composed in practiced neutrality. Jason Miller sat near the end, hands folded, expression attentive. Professor Whitmore stood at the side, not seated, not invited. The chair of the committee cleared her throat. "This is a fact-finding process," she said, "not an accusation." Ethan nodded. He had heard this sentence before. "We have concerns regarding the integrity of recent examinations," another member added. "Specifically, whether Mr. Cole had access to materials beyond what was permitted." Jason spoke then, his voice calm, measured. "I don't believe anyone intends harm," he said. "But fairness matters. If standards are flexible for some, they are meaningless for others." Ethan felt the weight of the words, not because they were false, but because they were incomplete. Whitmore stepped forward. "We have records," he said. He placed a folder on the table. It opened to pages dense with timestamps and notes. Library logs, surveillance records from public areas. A timeline of Ethan's presence that showed patience rather than privilege. "No private access," Whitmore said. "No materials restricted to enrolled students. Every step documented." One committee member frowned. "What about preparation?" Whitmore slid forward the spiral notebook. It looked small on the table. ordinary. Its cover was creased, the coil bent. Inside were pages filled with work that did not flatter itself. False starts crossed out, ideas tested and abandoned, grocery totals written beside integrals. This, Whitmore said, is not the record of someone gaming a system. It's the record of someone learning slowly, honestly, over years. Jason leaned forward. Anyone can write notes after the fact. Whitmore did not raise his voice. These pages are dated. The ink ages differently. The progression is consistent. This work predates the exam by years. The room went quiet. Another member spoke. And the exam itself? Whitmore handed over the graded paper. The margin notes were precise. They did not praise. They evaluated. Mr. Cole declined to claim a complete solution where one could not be justified, Whitmore said. That decision cost elegance and gained truth. The chair glanced at Ethan. Did anyone assist you? No, Ethan replied. He kept his voice steady. I worked at night, alone. I stopped where I couldn't be certain. Silence stretched. The committee conferred in low voices. Jason leaned back, jaw tight, eyes flicking once toward Whitmore, then away. Finally, the chair looked up. The review finds no evidence of misconduct. Ethan exhaled slowly. This matter is closed, she continued. However, Whitmore raised a hand. No conditions, he said. No asterisks. The chair hesitated, then nodded. No conditions. Outside the room, the hallway felt unreal, too bright, too ordinary. Ethan stood with his back to the wall, letting the echo fade. Whitmore joined him. You're cleared, he said. Officially. Ethan nodded. And unofficially? Whitmore considered. Power doesn't like being surprised, he said. It prefers explanations that protect itself. Jason passed them then, stopping just long enough to meet Ethan's eyes. Congratulations, he said. You're very convincing. Ethan did not respond. At home that night, Lily handed him a new drawing. This one showed a star behind a cloud, its points still visible. So, it doesn't disappear, she said. Ethan taped it beside the others and sat at the table, opening the spiral notebook. He slipped the committee notice inside, the exam, the drawings, a quiet archive of a life that refused to simplify itself. The truth had been confirmed, and with confirmation came something more dangerous than doubt. Leverage. The offer arrived the way all careful temptations do, clean, reasonable, wrapped in language that sounded like opportunity and read like relief. Ethan was called into an office on the 4th floor, one with windows that faced the river and chairs designed to suggest permanence. 2 people waited for him there, neither of whom introduced themselves by name. They did not need to. Institutions spoke through titles, not faces. A folder lay on the desk between them. We'd like to discuss a fellowship, one of them began. An exceptional arrangement. Ethan did not sit until invited. Old habits surfaced in rooms like this. The folder opened. Inside were numbers that softened the body before the mind could resist them. A stipend large enough to quit night work. Health coverage that would make the pharmacy calls disappear. Child care assistance, phrased delicately, as if Lily were a logistical concern rather than a person. Your performance has drawn attention, the other said. We believe this could be mutually beneficial. Ethan listened without interrupting. He had learned that silence often made people reveal more than questions ever could. There are, the first speaker continued, sensitivities. The word landed gently, carefully chosen. Your background, she said. Your current position. The narrative has spread. Ethan nodded. He waited. The fellowship would allow a reset, the second added. A clean presentation. We'd ask that your employment history here be framed as transitional, temporary, not emphasized, not denied, just softened. And the classes you've attended unofficially, the first said, eyes steady, wouldn't be referenced. Ethan felt the edges of the room sharpen. You're asking me to erase parts of the record. We're asking you to clarify it, she replied. Publicly. And privately? A pause. Privately. The past is the past. Ethan thought of the service corridor, the smell of wax, the quiet hours when buildings showed their bones. He thought of the spiral notebook in his bag, its pages crowded with truths that did not arrange themselves neatly. What happens if I don't? He asked. Neither person smiled. Opportunities narrow, the second said. That's not a threat. It's a description. They slid the folder toward him. We'll give you time, the first said. Think of your daughter. Ethan stood. I always do, he said. He left the office without the folder. That afternoon, Professor Whitmore asked him to step into Lecture Room B. The room was empty, sunlight cutting across the chalkboard at an angle that made the dust glow. The board was clean. The desks aligned. It looked, for once, uncomplicated. Sit, Whitmore said. Ethan did. Whitmore leaned against the desk, arms folded. They made you an offer. Yes. And? Ethan did not answer immediately. He reached into his bag and pulled out the spiral notebook, setting it on the desk between them. Its cover bore the marks of years, creases, faint stains, a corner bent and rebent. They want me to clean the story, Ethan said finally. So it fits. Whitmore nodded. It would make things easier. For them, Ethan said. Whitmore did not argue. Instead, he picked up a piece of chalk and wrote a single problem on the board. Simple, elementary even. Something that could be solved a dozen ways. Teach, Whitmore said. Ethan looked at him. There's no class. Whitmore gestured toward the empty seats. There is. Ethan stood. His body remembered the position before his mind accepted it. He picked up the chalk, feeling its dry weight, and began, not with symbols, but with questions. What do we know? He asked the room. Silence answered, but it was the attentive kind. He worked slowly. He left space between lines. He made a point of stopping to explain why he did not take certain shortcuts. When he reached the solution, he paused. This is one way, he said. Not the only one. Whitmore watched without comment. When Ethan finished, he set the chalk down. His hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of standing where he had once promised himself he would not stand again. Whitmore broke the silence. You could do this, he said, formally. Yes, Ethan replied. But not like that. Whitmore studied him. You're choosing the harder path. Ethan smiled faintly. I already live on it. That evening, at home, Ethan cooked dinner while Lily sat at the table, drawing quietly. The spiral notebook lay open beside her, pages fluttering as she turned them carefully. Daddy, she said, pointing to a page filled with dense writing. Is this where the stars go? Ethan looked. It was a proof he had never finished, interrupted years ago. Sometimes, he said. Sometimes they wait. She nodded, satisfied. After she fell asleep, Ethan sat alone with the fellowship folder he had not taken. Its absence felt louder than its presence would have. He wrote a short email instead. Polite, clear, final. Thank you for the consideration. I decline. He did not explain. The next morning, Whitmore announced that Ethan would lead a single guest session. No title, no credentials listed, just a name on the schedule. The room filled anyway. Ethan stood at the front, chalk in hand, heart steady. He had refused the offer. And refusal, he was beginning to understand, was not an ending. It was a beginning that carried weight. Responsibility. The room was not impressive. It sat between a laundromat and a shuttered bookstore, its windows glowing softly at dusk, its door scarred by years of hands that arrived uncertain and left quieter than they came. A paper sign taped inside the glass read, "Community Math Night." Someone had corrected the spacing with a pen. Ethan arrived early. He unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and stood still for a moment, listening. Folding tables lined the walls. A chalkboard leaned against one corner, its surface scratched but clean. A cardboard box of chalk waited on the ledge, pieces mismatched, honest. He rolled up his sleeves. People came one by one. A woman in a grocery uniform, name badge still clipped. A man with paint ground into his knuckles who apologized before he sat. Two teenagers who hovered at the threshold, deciding whether the room would accept them. Ethan greeted each of them the same way, with eye contact, with time. When Lily arrived, holding Mrs. Alvarez's hand, Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest. She took the front seat without asking, feet swinging, notebook open, pencil sharpened too carefully. She had drawn stars along the margins, small, deliberate, patient. "Ready?" Ethan asked. She nodded, serious. He began without ceremony. "We're not here to be fast," he said. "We're here to be honest." He wrote a problem on the board, simple enough to invite courage, open enough to reward questions. He asked people what they noticed. He waited. When answers came slowly, he let them arrive whole. The room changed shape. People leaned forward. Pens moved. Someone laughed at a mistake and then corrected it without embarrassment. Ethan guided when needed, stopped when stopping preserved truth. He did not finish anyone's thought for them. He let the work belong to the hands that held it. At the end, Lily raised her hand. "Yes," Ethan said, smiling. "If you can't finish," she asked, "is it still right?" Ethan considered the room, the tired faces, the careful attention, the chalk dust settling like snow. "Sometimes," he said, "especially then." Afterward, people lingered. Questions spilled into the aisles. Someone asked about night classes. Another asked if they could bring a friend next week. The teenagers returned to the board, arguing quietly over a line they refused to let go. Ethan cleaned up last, stacking chairs, wiping the board. Lily handed him a new drawing, a doorway with light behind it. "So people can see where to go," she said. He taped it to the chalkboard and turned off the lights. Weeks later, Jefferson Hall felt different. Not warmer, not kinder, just altered. A memo circulated, brief, precise, announcing a pilot program for non-traditional learners, evening access to seminars, transparent pathways for community scholars, teaching fellowships that counted lived constraint as experience, not deficit. No names were attached to the origin of the idea. Whitmore read the memo in his office, then stood and looked out at the courtyard where students crossed in steady lines. He did not smile. He nodded once, as if something long overdue had finally arrived on time. Jason Miller read it too. He paused longer than expected, then forwarded it without comment. Power adjusted. It always did. Ethan returned to Jefferson Hall one last time after his shift. The service corridor breathed its familiar cold air. The lights hummed. He walked past the door he had always used and continued on, steps steady, unhurried. Lecture Room B stood open. Inside, the board was clean. He approached it and wrote a single line. Nothing clever, nothing complete. Just a place to begin. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, hands clasped behind his back. "You won't be invisible anymore," he said. Ethan set the chalk down. "I wasn't," he replied. "I was just quiet." Whitmore watched him for a moment. "The program will need teachers." Ethan nodded. "I have a class." Whitmore inclined his head, accepting the answer as it was given. Outside, night settled over the campus with practiced ease. Ethan stepped into it and walked home, the spiral notebook warm in his bag, Lily's drawings tucked between proofs and plans. At the apartment, Lily was already asleep. He listened at her door, counted breaths, then sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook. He added a date, a short note, a star in the margin. He closed it gently. Across the city, doors that had once been closed stayed open a little longer. Lights that had been reserved learned to share. Knowledge shifted, not downward, not upward, but outward, toward hands that had waited. Ethan turned off the lamp and stood in the quiet. The service corridor would always exist, but it was no longer the only way in.